Story 1. The Forgotten Dollhouse. In the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania, Clara discovered an abandoned dollhouse in the attic of her grandmother's old mansion. The mansion was a shadow of its former self. Boards creaked underfoot, wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and dust lay thick over every surface. Clara had visited the mansion many times as a child, but it had been years since her last trip. After her grandmother's passing, it was up to Clara to clear out the place. She expected to find sentimental trinkets, maybe a few treasures, but nothing prepared her for what she found that rainy afternoon. The dollhouse stood in a forgotten corner of the attic, covered by a heavy cloth. It was enormous, almost as tall as Clara herself, and as she pulled the cover away, her breath caught in her throat. It was an exact replica of the mansion she stood in. Every detail was captured with unsettling accuracy, from the cracked window in the study to the crooked chandelier in the grand foyer. The tiny figures inside were no less remarkable. Each doll was dressed in meticulously crafted clothes, their faces painted with lifelike expressions. At first, Clara thought it was a charming relic of her grandmother's past, perhaps something she had crafted during long, lonely evenings. But the more Clara studied the dollhouse, the more uneasy she felt. The dolls seemed to shift positions. It was subtle at first. A maid who had been dusting a miniature shelf was now standing by the front door. Clara convinced herself it was her imagination. But over the following days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Then came the night Clara noticed a new figure. It stood in the dining room, staring blankly out a tiny window. The doll wore the exact same clothes Clara had on that day, a simple sweater and jeans, and its face, it was hers. Clara's heart raced. She reached out to touch the dollhouse but hesitated as a strange sensation washed over her. The attic grew darker, the air colder. When she glanced at the mirror on the opposite wall, her reflection was gone. Panic set in as Clara tried to leave the attic, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt herself shrinking, her vision narrowing until the towering walls of the attic faded into miniature proportions. The last thing she saw was her own face, staring down at her from inside the dollhouse. Her scream was swallowed by the silence of the tiny, glass-bound world. When Clara's family came to check on her weeks later, they found the mansion just as she had left it. The dollhouse still stood in the attic, its figures arranged perfectly. Among them was a new addition, a doll with bright blue eyes, frozen in silent terror. Story 2. Whispers in the Woods. Ethan loved the quiet of the woods. The forest offered him peace, a reprieve from the chaos of his daily life. Blackthorn Woods, however, was a place he had always avoided. The locals spoke of strange occurrences, voices carried by the wind, figures moving just beyond the tree line, and people who ventured in and never returned. Ethan had always dismissed the stories as superstition, but one fateful evening, he had no choice but to enter the forbidden forest. It started with his dog, Max. The golden retriever had bolted after a rabbit during their evening walk and disappeared into the dense underbrush. Ethan called after him, his voice echoing into the growing darkness, but Max didn't return. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that twisted like living things. A chill crept into the air as Ethan took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the forest floor. As he ventured deeper, he heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft he almost missed it, but then it came again. "Ethan," it called, delicate as a breeze. "Ethan, come here." At first, Ethan thought it was his imagination. But as he pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They didn't come from one direction but seemed to surround him, echoing between the trees. Then he recognized the voices. His mother, his sister, his best friend. They were all calling his name, their tones urgent, desperate. "Ethan, help us," they begged. His unease grew as the trees seemed to close in around him. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving too fast to be natural. The path he had followed was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and twisted roots. Panic set in as Ethan realized he was completely lost. Then the whispers turned into screams. Faces began to emerge from the darkness. Pale, hollow-eyed figures with mouths that stretched unnaturally wide. One by one, they appeared, surrounding him. Their eyes glowed faintly, their mouths contorting as they howled his name. Ethan tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees bending and twisting to block his path. The last thing he saw was Max, standing at the edge of the woods, barking. Then everything went black. The next morning, Max returned to the village alone. Ethan was never seen again. Locals added his name to the long list of those who had vanished in Blackthorn Woods, their souls claimed by the whispers. Story 3. The Silent Tenant. When Lisa moved into the old apartment, she was thrilled by its charm. The creaky floors and antique fixtures gave it character, and it was just a short walk from her new job. The landlord was friendly enough, but he had one peculiar rule. Don't open the basement door. Lisa laughed it off at first. Every old building had its quirks, and she assumed the basement was just in disrepair. But as the weeks went by, she began to notice strange things. At night, she heard scratching sounds coming from the basement. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, accompanied by soft whispers that seemed to come from deep below. One night, unable to sleep, Lisa decided to investigate. The basement door was locked, secured with heavy chains. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard it clearly, a voice calling her name. "Lisa," it whispered, soft and pleading. "Please, help me." Terrified, she contacted the landlord, but his phone was disconnected. The next day, the leasing office was empty, abandoned as if it had never been occupied. Lisa was alone. That night, the whispers grew more insistent, louder and closer. Against her better judgment, she broke the chains and opened the door. What she found wasn't a basement. It was a maze of dark, twisting corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls were damp and pulsing, as if alive. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and Lisa felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was down there, something that had been waiting for her. The door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers turned to laughter. Lisa ran through the maze, but every turn brought her back to the same spot. The shadows closed in, their forms taking shape. Human, but wrong, their faces twisted with malice. Lisa screamed, but no one heard her. The apartment above remained silent. Months later, a new tenant moved in. The landlord gave them the same warning. Don't open the basement door. Story 4. The Painting of Despair. Charlie loved wandering through antique shops, hunting for unique items to decorate his small apartment. One rainy afternoon, he stumbled upon a dusty little shop tucked away in an alley he'd never noticed before. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and wood polish, and the shelves were crammed with peculiar objects. But it was the painting in the back corner that caught his eye. The frame was ornate, chipped in places, and the canvas was coated with a dull sheen, but the image itself was captivating. It depicted a young girl standing in the middle of a dark, rain-soaked street. Her face was turned toward the viewer, her expression one of sorrow. Behind her, the street was shrouded in shadows, with faint figures barely visible in the mist. Something about the painting tugged at Charlie's heart. The shopkeeper was reluctant to sell it. "That painting has history," he said, avoiding Charlie's gaze. "People who've owned it before didn't fare well." But Charlie brushed off the warning and bought it anyway, thinking it would add character to his living room. At first, the painting was just a decoration, but over the following weeks, Charlie began to notice changes. The girl's expression seemed to grow sadder each time he looked at it. The shadows behind her deepened, and the faint figures became more distinct. One day, he swore he saw one of the figures take a step closer to the girl. Charlie dismissed it as his imagination, but the unease lingered. Then the dreams began. He dreamt of standing in the rain-drenched street from the painting. The girl would turn to him, tears streaming down her face, and whisper, "Help me." But when he tried to move toward her, the shadows would surge forward, their cold hands pulling him into the darkness. He'd wake up gasping, his body drenched in sweat. One night, unable to sleep, Charlie approached the painting. He turned on every light in the apartment, as if that could ward off the chill creeping up his spine. The girl's eyes seemed to follow him, pleading silently. The street behind her looked darker than ever, the figures now fully visible. They weren't just shapes, they were people. Their faces were twisted with anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. And then, Charlie saw something that made his blood run cold. His own face was among the figures in the background, staring back at him. The lights flickered, and a sound like distant thunder rumbled through the apartment. The rain in the painting seemed to move, the droplets streaking down the canvas. Charlie tried to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the girl, who now had a faint smile on her face. He felt the air grow heavy as the room seemed to dissolve around him. The last thing he saw was the street, not as a painting but as a real place, with the girl reaching out her hand toward him. When Charlie's friends came looking for him days later, they found the apartment empty. The painting still hung on the wall, but the girl was no longer alone. A new figure stood among the shadowed crowd, his face unmistakably Charlie's, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Story 5. Room 306. Sophie had always enjoyed the novelty of staying in small roadside motels during her business trips. There was something charming about their simplicity, their faded signs and outdated decor. But the Sunset Pines Motel was different. The moment she stepped into the dimly lit lobby, a chill crept up her spine. The receptionist, an older woman with a weathered face, handed her a key and muttered, "Don't go near room 306. Sophie raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. People loved their superstitions, and she wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. Her room, 304, was as plain as she expected. Faded curtains, a lumpy bed, and a television that only played static. Exhausted from the drive, she fell asleep quickly. She awoke to the sound of faint crying. Disoriented, Sophie checked the time, 3:06 a.m. The sound seemed to be coming from the room next door. Remembering the receptionist's warning, she hesitated but ultimately decided to investigate. The hallway was eerily quiet, the dim lighting casting long shadows. As she approached room 306, the crying grew louder, tinged with desperation. She knocked gently. "Hello? Are you okay?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it made Sophie's ears ring. She tried the doorknob, and to her surprise, it turned easily. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the parking lot lights filtering through the curtains. A child sat on the bed, their back to her. "Are you all right?" Sophie asked, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind her and the child turned. Their face was pale, their eyes hollow and black. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the child smiled, their mouth stretching impossibly wide. The room began to shift, the walls warping and melting like wax. Sophie found herself in a twisted version of the motel, the corridors stretching endlessly. Shadows darted across the walls, whispering her name. Each door she opened led her back to room 306, where the child sat, waiting, their laughter echoing through the space. Sophie screamed for help, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She realized with growing horror that the motel wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a labyrinth designed to keep her there forever. The child spoke, their voice low and guttural. "Now you're part of us." When the cleaning staff entered room 306 the next morning, it was empty. The bed was made, and there was no sign of Sophie. But guests who stayed at the motel afterward swore they could hear faint crying coming from room 306 at 3:06 a.m., followed by the sound of laughter.